So let's now move to Christopher Langan, right? So this is someone that came to prominence in the 90s. And he came to prominence simply because he took an IQ test at some point, did very well. I think the claim is something like 210. I think some people said that it was lower, right? An interesting little detail is that he runs this website, Mega Society, and more recently he has tried to take like an IQ test twice. Once, I believe, he was accused of taking it under an anonymous name just so he could like prepare for the test. And then the second time under his real name, and he did not score 210 in either instance. But he's an interesting fellow because in America, but maybe perhaps the world more broadly, people really place a lot of stock in IQ. Right. Beyond actually what it measures. Right. I think it is accurate to say that an IQ does measure, some kinds of intelligence. It does measure some, ability to do puzzles and whatnot, stuff like that. And it does, like if you look historically, right, people like Charles Darwin, Albert Einstein and others, they tended to have high IQs, especially like when you look at, the sciences or whatever, when you look at math.
But interestingly, the people who are considered the great artists never score as high. So it shows very much what I talk about, functionary, creationary, and visionary, and how you can't really measure them. Because I think the only artist that they estimate, I don't think I think Dolly had like a 125, so what they may have estimated. And how do you estimate that? But anyway.
Yeah. And interestingly, some people with like the highest documented IQs, they don't really go on to. It's not that, for example, they're not intelligent or whatever, but they don't end up producing things of value. I forget the name that I was looking up. There was like some person in the 20s or 30s that was at the time like the highest known IQ in the world. And you read like he was interested in all kinds of topics. Like he decided to do a book on, the influence of like, Native American culture on like, early American democracy, like stuff like that. But, like I was reading like a couple of chapters of the book. It's not very well written. The arguments aren't really like, shocking. So there's this, when you get to high enough levels, there does seem to be an inverse correlation between IQ and actual accomplishments, separate from simply saying, I scored well in the IQ test, which isn't.
Well, one of the people that's his rivals for the highest IQ, Marilyn Vos Savant. She married Robert.
I heard her.
What has she spent the last 30 years? She's basically been Dear Abby. Mm-hmm. She's been writing a column on I mean, here you are. She has, I think, documented a 220 IQ from what I had, which is higher than his supposed documentation. And she's been fucking Dear Abby.
Mm-hmm. And, I know that when publishers, when they, publish books, they sometimes choose their own titles. But I just remember thinking like some of the book titles that she chose were like very like trite and very silly. Right. So it's like, it's not, I doubt the content is necessarily all that better. Right. So, it is this odd kind of inverse relationship. And before we get to Langan himself, let's just talk about like our experiences with all of this, right? Because we definitely have some experience with standardized tests and kind of like dealing with like expectations like one direction or the other. And I in your essays you mentioned, for instance, that one time you were dragged to take an IQ test like the Mensa Society and some of your experiences there. Maybe like we could start with some of that.
Well, back in 92 or 93, my second cousin, or I guess it would be first cousin once removed, my natural mother's first cousin, so first cousin once removed, was a woman who was in Mensa. And she was quite smart, and she was part of the clan that lived up in the Duluth Superior area around the edge of Lake Superior. And so she came, we met one time, and then a few other times later, we got together. Now, she was probably actually a couple of years older than my birth mother. She was about 25 years older than me. She's dead now. I liked her, and she suggested that I take this IQ test to get into Mensa. And I remember the Mensa standardized test then in 93. I do remember the copyright was 1969 when the test was made. And so I took its typical 150 to 200 questions. And I remember there were probably 12 to 15 questions that I knew the answer they wanted, but I disagreed with the premise. The two that stick in my mind the most, and as you sort of rethink things, they become bigger than they really were one was one was about how many side they would have polygons, and you have to pick the polygon with equal sides, equal number of sides. So it would be a square, a hexagon, an octagon, etc. And then there was a triangle, and then there was also a circle. And they wanted me, of course, to pick the triangle. But I said, there's two possible answers, because a circle has an infinite amount of sides. And is infinity, even or an odd number? Well, it's neither. It's infinity. So I disagreed with that premise there. So I did choose infinity, I remember. And then the other one was a more social question. It had 4 or 5 choices. It said, what is the odd utensil out, or the odd thing out? And so it said on a table, it would have a knife, a spoon, a fork, a cup, and I think it was a cup, and then a saucer. Or what thing that it doesn't belong here. And I know that they wanted to say, I forget what, they wanted me to say one of the other things. But I haven't grown up poor, said the saucer could be out. So and it showed the cultural bias, because, the idea implicit is that everyone would have a cup and a saucer. Whereas, they'd have to have that. I forget what the actual one was, but those two stick in my mind. One with the obvious cultural bias against people who were impoverished, and the other one that was mathematics. And like I said, there were 12 or 15 questions, and I scored, I think, in the 94th percentile, and you have to be in the 98th percentile. But I'm sure that if I had gotten those 12 or 15 questions, had given them, I would have probably gotten in the 98th percentile. But the people in the Minnesota Mensa Society there, or the Twin Cities Mensa Society, whatever it was, were typical nuts. I remember these two nerds playing chess and almost getting into a fist fight, arguing over who was the better general, Lee or Grant. And then I remember this attractive blonde woman who was probably a decade, 10, 12, 15 years older than me. I was, I guess, 27 at the time. She was probably 40-ish. And I remember her coming up, and I was wearing a turtleneck. And I remember her just rubbing my chest and saying how she liked my pectoral muscles. And I remember thinking, okay. And the 3 or 4 times she came up to me, she was rubbing it. And if I hadn't been there with my cousin, who knows, she might have invited me out back to do her or something. But
didn't you say that you try to talk to her, but she only wanted to rub, but not have any further interaction?
Yeah. And there were other ones that fit this there. And I was really surprised, because I figured they would be a bit, different, but they fit the typical stereotype of the nerd, geek, whatever you want. And so that was my experience with Mensa and these tests, which, again, I could see what they wanted me to say, but I just on principle couldn't say it, because I didn't believe that was just the one correct answer that they wanted.
Yeah. So, I mean, like when I think of like Christopher Langan's story, I am kind of like sympathetic to his story. Like, I also grew up like feeling like a misfit, right? I grew up thinking that I had talents and I had an intelligence that I couldn't really express in the context of school. I think back when I was younger, it was more kind of a lot of it was probably ego, because I mean, by the time that I got to the point where I could express something of value, I had already. I was already a teenager. In my early adulthood, I started writing, right? So before that, it must have been like partly ego, but same thing with like Langan, right? He grew up in poverty. He grew up in an abusive household, and he grew up in a way where whatever, intelligence that he thought he had, he couldn't really express. I forget what he said about his schooling, but I wasn't really good at school until much later, right? So like when I was in middle school, I remember I almost was left back several times. I almost, I almost had to go to summer school. I was always like on the verge of failing a class, partly because I just didn't really want to do the work. Not because like I thought I was too smart for it, but I honestly just wanted to do other things, right? I wanted to like go outside. I used to like love going into like the train tracks in Brooklyn. I used to, just like do everything other than work. And that only changed at the end of 8th grade, where I was like, all right, look, so I was through these classes, like they put me through these like algebra math classes. And if I do well on some of these tests, I won't have to take these classes in high school. So since I already sunk 3 years into it and I didn't learn what I needed to learn, I was like too lazy or too whatever. Let me at least try to do well on this test. So after like, nearly failing everything, I did end up doing very well on the tests. I was able to skip a bunch of those classes when I got to high school. And when that happened, I actually felt for the first time like pretty empowered, right? Because again, I wasn't reading books. It's not like I had all these like wonderful complex ideas at the time. I just look to society as a way to tell me, Alex, like, are you worthwhile? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, you will be able to accomplish this and that. You'll be able to do well on this test. You'll be able to do well in school. You could get into a good college. And because I like that feeling, I remember distinctly trying to chase that feeling. So by the time I got to high school, I kind of, I shaped up. I started doing well in school. I graduated something like number 4 in my high school. In college, I was a valedictorian. So I became kind of like addicted to that feeling. However, I do also distinctly remember when I was in high school, when I was a junior, and I had to start taking the SATs. I was like, you know what, let me take the SATs blind. Let me not take any practice tests. Let me just like go sit down and see what I would do without any kind of studying. And because at that point I had already like started reading books, right? I had already started like thinking about the world and started realizing, you know what, there's a lot of distinctions between me and how I approach things versus everyone around me. And I want to explore why that is. I want to see if there's any meaning there outside of like my own feelings. And I remember like sitting down to take the test. And when I got back my results, like everything was average. I got like, 500 math, 500 verbal, which was like square in the middle of average. And because I was still kind of like stuck in this idea of I want society to tell me that I'm worthwhile, I was really upset. I remember I was very upset that I had an average score. So I started like studying really hard for the next SAT. And I got like several books of practice tests. I took probably 30 practice tests. I would do, like entire weekends, just like timing myself. I would put on a clock. And every, time that I would take the test, I was like, let me see if I could do this 5 minutes faster, 10 minutes faster. And I got better and better and better. And one thing that I noticed when I started taking these tests is I was like, wow, like they're telling me, they're trying to explain to me that the answer here, for example, for some like verbal question or whatever, that this is the right answer. But I know for a fact that you could really reassess this in some other way. This doesn't have to be the answer, but I know what they're looking for. I know what they want. So I really got myself into the mentality of a test creator. Okay. I was like, I know what they're looking for. I know what they want. This isn't to prove anything anymore. I just need to get these high scores. I need to get to a college of my choice, and I need to get into college for free. I don't want to pay for shit. So let me just suck it up and let me do this. I went from literally totally average scores like 510 or 520 to perfect scores, which should be considered a statistical anomaly. This should be considered grounds for like, did he cheat? You're not supposed to go from 500 to 800 simply by studying. And the fact that I was able to do that, on the one hand, I was happy because I still had these feelings of like, I want society to like, tell me, Alex, you're worthwhile, you're good, you're whatever, you're deserving. To also thinking, but I didn't really do anything except spend fucking like 3 months consecutively doing nothing but test taking. So by the time that I got to college and I realized, okay, so this is what it's going to be. I was like, I'm going to have to like, for me to like survive this for the next 4 years, I'm going to have to like completely eliminate like any feeling of college is going to give me my self-definition. It's going to provide for me some sort of way to build meaning, some sort of way to like feel good about myself. I need to use this as a means to an end. But I was very depressed in college. I was very much feeling like this is wrong. What they're doing in like, you know, what they're teaching me about literature is wrong. What they want from me in terms of papers is wrong. The one time that I've given a perfectly honest paper, the one time that I said exactly what I felt and did exactly what I wanted to do, I got something like a C-, right? So I basically figured out there is a way to kind of game the system. There's a certain set of protocols that you could follow to give people what they want. And in return, you're going to get a piece of paper. You're going to get someone, you know, like saying nice things about you. They're going to look well upon your resume. But I knew that I was kind of like faking it. And what kind of struck me listening to Chris Langan is he's kind of the opposite. On the one hand, it seems like through his interviews that he's like a total like fucking rebel. But on the other hand, he's sharing these stories that he sees an IQ test and he becomes really, really curious about how well he could do. I never had that feeling. For me, it was the opposite. For me, it was like, I need to get through this, but this is bullshit. And I resent having to do this. I also felt this way in college. And yet he takes this test and it becomes his entire identity, right? It becomes his entire identity. Everything that he could point to is, I took an IQ test once, I allegedly scored a 210, and now this is going to be my claim to fame. This is why, you know, I'm going to go on these TV shows. This is why people will give any kind of shit about me. So he completely latches onto it, right? So I feel like at a certain point, like, you know, in our maybe teenage years, or like there's this kind of divergence, right? That he's not really willing to talk about because, you know, you read anything that he says, or you look at his interviews, it's all ego, 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 right? He doesn't want to be vulnerable. He doesn't want to be honest with others or with himself.
Well, so, he's someone from what I can tell that is he needs the approval. And you're being a valedictorian, and it shows the way that the school system here in the U.S. at least is totally ass backward. My mom, who was just functionarily smart, very smart actually, in a functionary way, back in the 1930s, she got into college by the age she was 16. She did college in 2 years, and by 19 she had completed business school. And then she was out in the 1930s being a working woman, working as an accountant and a bookkeeper. Now, for example, I could have graduated even just trying half-heartedly in my public school years. I could have graduated a year and a half early if they had where they would graduate if you got enough stuff. I mean, I just breezed through it, and that's how I fell in with the gang too. Is that I was bored and I had to go to this school and just hang around because I could cut classes and I could pass the test easily, and there was no reward for someone who could do that. Now, not that that's, you know, I mean, what they should have done is, you know, you should be able to rapid advance kids and push them. But the focus of the American system is on the bottom, not the top. And because they do that, if you look at someone like this Christopher Langan, he seemed like a very emotionally needy and fucked up person from all the stuff. There was a 4-hour interview. You only have the half-hour Errol Morris one you want to look at.
Yeah, but I looked at that one as well. Yeah.
Yeah, the 4-hour one where some Asian kid is just basically fawning all over him, even though he's speaking in the same nonsensical way that Jordan Peterson does. It's more intellectualized. But if you look at his writing with that CTMU, it's very Ayn Rand. It's leaden. There's no, and even the way he speaks, there's no sense of a real personality there, other than there's that little coiled up little boy inside of him that's resentful, and it's very much like Peterson's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that interview. The interview begins like this is literally how it starts. The guy interviewing him says, the opening question is literally, so Chris, in your experience, how long does it take the average person to understand your CTMU? That's literally the opening question, as if that would even matter, as if like, like not even like, let's assess whether or not it's worth understanding for whatever duration of time you would invest in it. It's, it's all about the outside. It's other people, like, who cares, right? And this is the thing that I'm getting at. Like, I never want to be someone that, like cares about like, I did well in college. Like I had, like good grades or whatever. Like I'm always thinking like the next book, like what is the next thing I'm going to write? What is the next essay going to look like? The only thing you have is actual accomplishments, right? And when you look at people like Chris or others that, like you said, like this coiled up little boy, I'm always aware that I have that potential inside me to like regress back to that coiled up little boy, right? Being needy when I was young, dealing with all kinds of garbage when I was young. You could easily regress into that. The only way that you could avoid that is you cannot look at what other people tell you. You cannot, try to get things from society, right? Like a pat on the head. You always have to do things your own way, and you cannot depend on these kinds of tests. It's just bullshit.
If you read that CTMU, and I read the first 40 or 50 pages and then just got bored with the terrible writing, it's basically a justification for God. Even he calls God, he uses the acronym grand something with an O, determiner, or something of the universe. And it's just so silly. And I the way he describes it, and I've written True Life, and you said you wanted to do some shows on the True Life stuff, and even though that's like now 18 years since I wrote it. But the thing is, if you look on my E-Cosmoetica website, I have a video. It's actually the tape recording, an audio tape recording of me on Christmas of 1972 with my mom, my dad, and my sister. And I told you, and I'm not trying to dick wave in this way against Langan, but my guess is that Chris Langan and being bullied for being big or whatnot, he probably didn't have as bad a life as I did growing up. Yet if you listen to that 1972 Christmas at the Schneider's video and just listen to the audio, I sometimes look around like, God, I was an ebullient kid. Nothing could get me down. This is when literally the same within a year or so that I first saw probably by that time I'd seen 2 or 3 people murdered. I had been deemed the smart little kid by the local gangsters who needed deliveries of this, that, or the other thing. I was doing all that. I too was bullied by a kid named Diddy and his brother Rough Rider. There was all this, and yet you listen to that, and I mean, granted, you go through ups and downs, but here I am on Christmas Day. I got a tape recorder. This was the thing that satisfied me. I asked for a tape recorder, and I'm pretending like I'm interviewing my parents, like man on the street. But I'm so ebullient. And when I first found that and put that online, I listened to it. I was like, boy, this really goes against people would be like, oh, he must have grown up wealthy or something because he sounds so happy and well adjusted there. Mm-hmm. But that goes to show you though that you can overcome certain things. And one of the things with this Langan, even if we accept that he has a 200 or so IQ, there's something, I don't believe in emotional intelligence to the degree that a lot of people do. I think there is emotional intelligence, but my God, there's such like I said, this resentment that is so obvious in those videos we just did of Peterson. And if we listen to that, you just look at the man's body posture. He's like, yeah, motherfucker, yeah, mother. And in that 30 minutes with the Morris video, I mean, he's back and forth between being the coiled up little boy who's being picked on and the bully himself that wants to basically say to the world that I'm the best. I could just imagine him being what 1984, what did they call the head leader in the book? I forget what they call him, but I could just imagine him being one of those fascist leaders. He wants a bust like Mussolini.
Well, he sort of admits that in the Morris video, like indirectly, right? I mean, like de facto, he's going to be the one of this like high IQ super species that is calling the shots in terms of who gets to reproduce and who doesn't, right? Yeah. I assume he's going to have a harem of women that are just sucking him off and riding him and producing babies. Like I assume that that's really what what kind of drives him. So, I mean, let's just go through this video.
And the thing with the eugenics too. I've often said with people that there's good eugenics and bad eugenics. If in 50 years they're able to genetically weed out the causes of dwarfism, that's a good idea. And I always use the dwarf thing because I knew a family of dwarfs. And I knew how the two boys there suffered there. That's a good thing. But he is certainly advocating the very thing that makes people think eugenics is 100% bad.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I'm not sure to what degree he understands this. Like, it also seems like he's not. Yeah, he doesn't seem like, again, like going back to like, I don't want to, make it sound like I'm picking on him, but again, like he is presenting himself like to society, and it does seem like there's like a lot of stuff emotionally going on. Again, like I still can't get over when he says that there's this IQ test running around and he like lying around. And he's like, I'm very curious about this. I have never fucking taken an IQ test, and I would never care to, right? To the extent that I've taken tests, it was always to get something out of it. And I just want to forget it at this point. But again, again,
it gets down to accomplishment. Just today, and probably by tomorrow, I'll finish another play that I'm doing, a play about the Vikings encountering the Native American Mi'kmaq people of the maritime provinces. And it's told from their point of view, the Mi'kmaqs, and the Vikings are seen as the savages, and they're scorned by the Native American. And it's an interesting reversal. But even in that just one play, there's more intellectual heft than in all of what this guy has done in a fucking career. But this society says, oh, he scored 200, 210 on some test. That's better than an accomplishment. It's so reductive, and it's one of the reasons that scientists and society hasn't progressed, is because they value the wrong things. They value money. They value these markers that a small elite group that doesn't even realize that what they're propounding in an IQ test doesn't predict accomplishment. Just like one of the things that makes Beethoven or a Mozart so remarkable is they were prodigies, but they kept it up. The vast majority of child prodigies, the only thing that a child prodigy does is they have an adult intellect young. Most of them never go beyond that. So by the time everyone else is at 35, they've caught up with the prodigy.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's.
Yeah. And one more point that I want to make about this, like more broadly, is, you and I would both agree that the world is clearly not a meritocracy, right? And because there is, though, some like quantifiable means to like measure like IQ or whatever, that gives people like Langan, this kind of niche and opportunity to recruit people into their like little pet projects, right? Because they could say, well, look, yes, we're all agreeing the world is not a meritocracy, but here, look at my accomplishment, right? Look at my high IQ. I can be the one that calls the shots. Sign on to my project, right? And I'll show you the way. I'll show you the truth, as Peterson says, right? In his kind of like guruship. So
before you started, I was just looking up to see what the CTMU actually stood for. So I just Googled it. It said Cognitive Theoretical Model of the Universe. Now, if there's a CTMU wiki, I'm sure he's behind that, or his fans are. And he even said the CTMU pronounced catmu. Now, I'm sure that is probably what Langan refers to it, and he thinks that's probably creative. And I literally just didn't see that until 90 seconds ago. And yeah. I would bet most of my minimal wealth that he, Langan, instead of saying kit mu or kit moo, he said cat mu because it's cute, probably to impress his wife or something, who's another woman who has, I guess, a high IQ.
Yeah, high IQ, and also we'll get into their kind of like personal beliefs about things that have become like really odd and like very malignant as well, right? To the extent that they're on social media. But anyway, this is the Errol Morris, a documentary from like, I believe 1999. Yeah. He did a bunch of profiles, and one of the profiles was Christopher Langan.